Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to Wigton Book Festival Working Lunch. I'm Polly Puller, and I'd like to thank all our generous sponsors and supporters, and in particular, Nature Scott, who've sponsored this event as part of the celebrations of the Year of Coasts and Waters. If you also feel able to support the festival to help secure our future on into the uncharted and stormy seas that doubtlessly lie ahead, we really would be most grateful. Now, it gives me the very greatest pleasure to be here to welcome Tamsin Calidas today. Her memoir, I Am an Island, published earlier this year, is a Sunday Times bestseller and has been described by Vogue as the memoir of the year. Beautifully written, this emotional and poetic account of her move from London to a life of extreme self-sufficiency on a Hebridean island is powerful indeed. A photographer, as well as a writer, Tamsin has a deep connection to the natural world, and in particular to the tempestuous seas that surround her island home. She's going to open this event with a reading, and then we'll have a chat. As it's a slightly shorter event than usual, there will not be the chance to ask any questions today. Finally, the event will close with a very poignant film clip that I can guarantee will take your breath away. Please join me now in welcoming Tamsin.
Thank you, Polly. So I've taken this reading as a small gathering of extracts from my book to give you a taste of the nature and the seasons and some of the challenges that are explored in my book, I'm an Island. So I'm going to start at chapter 4, Croft. The grasses are running free in flowing waves over the hillsides. The wind breathes on them, billowing a great rippling fullness and swell. Everywhere seed heads are ripening, flaxen husks swollen taut, straining to shear and scatter next year's crop along invisible opening seams. As I walk across the hills, the air is heady with a rich abundance. It is a herbaceous, aromatic scent, warmed and seasoned by a strange sirocco that blows in gusts off the sea. It is wearying at the end of the summer, waiting for that harvest. Some days, I wonder if it will ever come. Once the birch bark splits and clouds of thistledown drift, the fields are shorn and another cusp is passed. Hares streak from the hollow quivering rushes, and sea eaglets stretch adolescent wings over the bare hills. I watch those cruel talons soaring seaward on the freshening salt uplift, suspended, scarcely moving. Below, tufts of fleece snag across the rough grazing, fluttering like torn prayer flags. It is then that a slow, aching hunger is felt keening in the wind. Winter arrives sharply like a breath of ice. Its bitter northeasterly wind ravages the exposed cliffs and headland. Wet, blackened stumps of heather are barely distinguishable from the glistening grey rocks. The livestock rounds become a daily sliding battle after the grasses and rushes die back. 40 hungry mouths wait desperately by empty troughs, foraging lean pickings. Some worries keep you awake at night. Hunger is one. So is debt. When one starts to feed another, that is when things get complicated. For a year and a half, maybe longer, I have been in the eye of a perfect storm. I find comfort in the low burning husk of winter, slowly rising over the mountains. It irradiates the croft with light. Once the lambing begins, I have no choice but to endure the raw, bitter weeks of early March. When the ewes start pressing and their lambs start coming, there is nothing you can do to delay those lives from being born. It is difficult and painful working with those crushing contractions while still trying to protect my slowly healing hands. There have been complications due to the bones having been incorrectly set and the muscles have atrophied. Lambing requires 2 hands, and with no other assistance, I have to use both of mine. There are times when I need to work freely and have to grit my teeth and remove the cast. The fingers were so badly hurt, they still ache and are often stiff and sore. I try to take comfort in the knowledge that winter is ending and spring, a time of renewal, is on the way. But in April, the weather is shocking Hailstones, snow flurries, freezing, torrential rain, and the days and nights blur into one another. I'm out all hours with Maud in the icy hail, wind, rain, and plummeting temperatures. I create a small billet for Maud and me in the barn, a few blankets folded into a bed and laid onto clean, fresh straw where I can curl into her warm fur and sleep for a few hours. The two of us wrapped deep in blankets in the soft breathing darkness, our own breaths steaming in the cold air. On the nights it is raining, it feels beautiful and quiet inside, listening to the wind and rain hammering against the corrugated iron roof. I doze alongside my sheep, waking in the early hours to the restless bleating of the ewes as they strain, heads back, turning and pawing the ground with the first pains of labour. There is a bone-clicking sound as jaws clench and breath is stifled, as nostrils flare, flanks heave, and then the sound of gentle panting. And then I know to get up, to move slowly, to help ease a tiny, slippery, warm life out on the straw and to clear its airways. And afterwards, when the lambs stagger to their feet and I have checked the flow of colostrum to teats and they have sucked, I go outside, wash my face and hands in the water butt and gaze up at the sky.
Thank you, Tamsin. That was lovely. Beautiful, beautiful writing. I could just feel all those things. I think the first question I have for you is, were you a child of nature? Were you somebody who was always aware of the natural world from a very early age, or has it come to you later on in life?
I think it came with much greater intensity later. I grew up in the rural countryside and had quite a difficult childhood that I touch on with very slight glances in this book. And the nature was always something that I turned to, and the animals as a child, I suppose, for company and presence, and also a very young sort of strength, I suppose, sort of to deal with some of the things that I needed to deal with younger. But really, it came much later when we were sort of really investing our all in developing the soil and all the animals here on the Croft.
Well, it's quite a brave thing to do. I mean, you really did bite the bullet and throw yourself into a very, very different environment to the one that you experienced in London. I mean, if you could press rewind, would you do it all again?
I think so, definitely. There was so much potential. We'd looked everywhere. We'd looked in the UK. We'd actually looked overseas as well. And we kept returning, both of us, to Scotland. My ex-Rab was from Scottish roots. And I have strong Celt threads through my mother's side, both Scottish and Irish. And very, very different environment. But landing on the island, there was so much potential with the land. And what we found when we actually started to work it was that really these sort of ideas of territory that sometimes we sort of think about, you know, even in our work, the sort of work that we're used to and things that we do, sometimes can prohibit us, our own minds can prohibit us from trying to learn something new. And what I found was as soon as I started working more closely with the soil, these felt very much skills that lay very deep inside, and the more tactile you were with those and the more that you gave those the opportunity to start to grow and to inhabit their own strength, that's when that sort of learning almost was kind of coming through from a deeper source. I like to think somewhere back in my ancestry, land and my blood have always been very deeply entwined, and that's something I feel very much now with the ease with which, you know, you're handling your livestock and the craft.
I mean, so in your book, you describe the weather absolutely brilliantly on many occasions. And having spent my childhood in Ardnamurchan, and I know what that weather is like, and it's like nothing else on earth sometimes. And I think people don't realise that in the winter can be so eternal. It just goes on and on and on, and that grey and the wind that you are constantly battling, everything you carry ends up heading off somewhere else where you didn't expect it to go. You described that brilliantly, but did you actually expect it to be just as savage as it was? Were you surprised?
Well, I suppose you're in it, so you're immersing. I guess, when you're thawing out and warming up afterwards, that's when you start to question, what am I doing? And maybe, getting the right kit and things like that's important. And one of the things that we did very early on was planting windbreaks, and at the beginning. You don't see a huge amount of progress, and then suddenly sort of 5 years in, you start to see those trees and so on established. So yeah, you're starting to read the landscape differently and reading the terrain, and that's something that's really become second nature to me. I suppose also developing my photography there in the land, it really sort of touches something in me, and trying to capture the sea and the sky and those different changing patterns of weather as they're happening is something that always draws me to it, almost like a paint canvas. So now I tend to sort of, when the weather's really hammering in, that's when I'm heading out and into it. It's almost in reverse. But yeah, it's a toughening up. You probably remember yourself, early years when you're first starting to handle things, even as a child. There are certain harder shifts of weather that perhaps you're drawn to. I love the rain, and I love the wind, particularly at night. Even in the winter, I tend to sleep with my window open. And I'm just down here in the south at the moment, ahead of another festival, Cheltenham, and I'm surprised with how quiet everything is, with the skies. And it's, if I miss anything, it's that's kind of, this feeling of being drawn back. So
it has a luminosity too, doesn't it? I mean, the West Coast has the most incredible
and the lights. Yeah.
It changes every minute. And I mean, if you're an artist or a photographer, I mean, I don't know about you, but I spend my life chasing light. I'm always looking for light, and it always seems to be in a different area where you don't happen to be standing at that moment. There's light on the sea, and you described that very, very powerfully and very beautifully. I was really transported there with some of your absolutely glorious descriptions. And in fact, they carried me along, and they must have carried you along when you were experiencing a lot of problems. I mean, it wasn't easy. You went there and the house was just a complete shell, really, by the sound of it. I mean, that must have been horrendous, wasn't it?
Well, right at the beginning, when we first saw the Croft, it was, as I said, it was really the potential of the land. So the house was there, and there'd been some work done to it, but there'd been trouble with the house before. So we just really rolled our sleeves up with very little experience. My husband, Rab, was very, very good with joinery and welding and things like that. So, I mean, we did have a sort of base skill set there, but it's amazing what you can achieve. And remember, we were building a home for family. So that was something that really gave us that sort of heart impetus to really give our all to. So yeah, it took quite some time to get that into a habitable condition. We were both of us living outside in the caravan, and then finally moved in. And it was really the winter conditions that drove us in. Later, I think when Rab left to go back down south, just to escape back to the light again, it was really the light every day that got me up in the mornings, and also your responsibility to the livestock. But watching that great husk of sun rising over the horizons, rising over an extraordinary panoramic of peaks and horizon and sky and this shifting light, it was the light that called me each day into the day. And tracking around the Croft and seeing to your ewes and the flock, young lambs and so on, that I think having that responsibility was really invaluable, because that really kept you outward facing rather than becoming too internal. But yeah, I think for everybody, and I think this is going to be a challenge for a lot of people just now, thinking about the solitude and so on, particularly up in Scotland during the next few months, and really sort of through my own experiences, so important to try and find ahead of time tasks and things that you've kind of put off that you really want to sort of get yourself immersed into. I think you need to have those indoor and outdoor projects when you're living alone. Would you agree with that, Polly.
Absolutely, I really would. But I think you and I, as we had a conversation before, I think we appreciate that both of us are fiercely, and it is fiercely artistic and creative. And so when you've got that creativity, when it's long, dark days, if you write or you take photographs or you've got photographs to sort, that you can immerse yourself in that. I do feel very sorry for people who don't have that creative side. And I'm sure with your creativity, I kept thinking when I was reading your book, when the awful things were happening, your creativity was also carrying you through, because you would be immersing yourself in seeing beautiful things and recording them either with your camera or with your pen.
Yeah, I think that was it was a very important process, that. But there was also, I think, a point, I had 2 broken hands at that time, and
how did you break them? I'm just going to interrupt you there, just to tell the audience how you actually broke them, because that was pretty horrible.
So I'd actually urge people to read the book for
they will.
That.
I think they will.
Yeah, I'd urge people to the book for both of those experiences in my book, I'm an Island. The very first one, very interesting that I was walking the Croft, and I just happened to slip, and in that funny way when you can just land awkwardly, and I shattered my hand very, very badly, my left hand. And actually, it was a break that 3 orthopedic surgeons said it was the worst break that they'd seen in a very, very long time. And that really took about 4 or 5 years to heal. It's still not quite right, but you have to keep using it. Otherwise, you lose that power. But one of the fallouts of that was music is something that's also very important to me. And I write of this in my book as well, not just the music of the natural world, but also playing the piano and later the viola. And it was very, very difficult and quite challenging not to be able to have that form of expression. And living alone, I had to find other means in order to find that sort of heart connection and companionship. And that's really, in a sense, something that led me to step much more closely to nature. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful, because sometimes, and again, turning to these very strange times just now, when all of those usual things that we rely on suddenly shear away, it can be very shocking and challenging initially. And then we're called upon to dig deeper and find something else in ourselves. So I like to think sometimes life asks of us more than we ever thought. And then it's up to us really to step up to that and to really find what it is inside us that we can discover and give to not just bring us through that time, but actually kick us into a whole new phase of our lives.
Yeah. I think it's impossible for me sitting here now not to ask you a little bit about the hostilities that you encountered when you were first on the island and throughout a lot of your time. I was very saddened, but I was also very disappointed, because I've always found myself that some of these small, remote, rural communities, there's always, of course, in every community, it's like in the school playground, there was always somebody that wasn't very nice that spoiled things for you. But you seem to have a lot of it. And I thought that was quite unusual. And it disappointed me terribly that had happened. I know you've got some strong feelings on it. And I wonder if you'd like to just tell us a little bit more about that.
So I suppose going into any new community, change is difficult, territory is difficult. Wherever you go, wherever there are changes to the status quo, there are always going to be ripples. When we arrived, we really integrated. We immersed very deeply into the community. We volunteered, we shared and offered helps in that way that makes this part of the world so very special. And life was good. But there was always going to be some people there, this is just life, that didn't want you there. And our situation was complicated by a situation that predated us. So disputes over land are very, very common. And I think there was quite a difficult situation linked to our croft and the sell of it before we actually came to the island. So we kind of inherited some of those animosities, and we hoped those would just settle and go away. And very sadly, they didn't. And again, that's very common. Life was made an awful lot more difficult after my husband left, and I was left in a very vulnerable situation with 2 broken hands and trying to run the whole setup alone and on my own. And what I've been surprised about is really quite how many people have reached out following the publication of this book, not just on the island, and actually throughout this book. A silent thread that hasn't been written in was, my experience wasn't the only one. There are always going to be vulnerable people in any small communities, and in fact, in any walk of life. We're all human. There are always going to be dominant structures, and there are always going to be those at the top and those at the bottom. And sometimes it's easier to look the other way. So there were occasions through this period when others were reaching out to me and saying, can you help? And, that's important. And I think, these questions of unconscious bias and so on that are so sort of prevalent and have been so prevalent as well over the last few months, attitudes can be so endemic and can be so very naturalized that sometimes it's important to name them and to be able to lift them back up into general dialogue and currency so that we can all discuss them. And this is something that's really, I think, been really uplifting after the writing of this book. I've had quite so many letters, emails, phone calls, all sorts of contacts with people, not just on the island, but throughout Scotland, throughout the UK, from people who have said, I have experienced, albeit perhaps in a different walk of life, very, very similar. So what I'd say on this is, any community is a microcosm of a bigger macrocosm. We are all human. And even though you might only have 130 people or now close to 180 people, we are going to be directly proportionately representative of a bigger, wider world. And I think it's important for us to be able to, step beyond that, and always to try and step forward and offer a hand to someone. Perhaps it might not be comfortable to help them and stand by them because it exposes yourself, but sometimes these things are so important to kind of shift that status quo.
I mean, I think it's always very difficult on an island because you really are in the proverbial goldfish bowl, aren't you? I mean, everybody knows what you are doing, and they know what you're doing even before you've done it. It's one of these things that I've always found, quite amazing. I mean, in Ardnamurchan, when I go down to stay there, they all know exactly, that I'm going there and what I've brought with me before I've even got out of the car. It's just it always makes me laugh. It's small communities. I remember when I was talking a lot to Lawrence McEwen, who lives on the island of Muck, and it's a very, very small community there, you sort of average 30 people, but they have a lot of people who go there trying to escape their problems. And Lawrence has always said that, when you go to an island, your problems, if you have serious problems, they become even bigger. I think it's very heartening in your book that any problems that you encountered subsequently to going to the island, you overcame. And I think it shows an enormous strength of character that you've stayed there. I think that says it all, really. I'd like to talk to you very much about your great success, which I so enjoyed reading in the book, where you went to the market with some lambs and you got the top price. After, having known nothing about sheep, you really cracked it. And that was a high point for me in your story. Would you like to tell the audience a little bit about that, please? Because it was delightful.
Well, it was a really gratifying sale that. There have been a few very fraught years after my hands were broken and trying to raise these sheep and really learning how to do that solo because, we'd really split chores before. And these ewes, they're between 40 and 60 kilos. So, they're really strong. So actually learning softer, gentler ways of handling becomes really important. I developed my flock. It had started from a very common source, which is the blue-faced Leicester top, which has a very fine wool and very strong conformation and bone. Putting that with the native breed, which was the black-faced ewes, and they're a lot more canny and spirited and hardy. It's a really lovely mix, and that gives the first cross of a first cross mule, which has very beautiful speckled markings, often black and brown, and they unify the best traits of both of those breeds. And then I crossed them again, and I did quite some years of experimenting with what I was going to put with that. Beltecs can be, they're a sort of slightly rounder breed, and they can be harder to deliver, the lambs that come out of that. And Suffolks are a little bit smaller off the ground. And in the end, I decided to practice with a Texel top and putting that to my ewes. And I had a very, very old top, and I was astonished where it was actually his lambs that gave these amazing prices and so on. And what was so extraordinary about that was when you breed commercially, your lambs are always put either for store or they go straight for meat, and they're not designed for breeding. And my lambs were separated out independently by somebody else there who was helping with the auction. And they said, these are good enough, and let's put these into a separate pen, and we'll put these forwards for breeding. So, those pens came top in a market that had 10,000 head going through that day and were commended. So that was really exciting and very gratifying. And probably I should have stopped at that point. And that's something where I really hold my hands up and say, that is the point that you should have stopped. And that is the point that I set myself to have stopped. But circumstances happened in such a way afterwards that it became imperative that I continued. And it was not just a point of pride, but it was a point of showing to myself that I actually could do that next stage of more serious breeding. And that's really where I thought that I'd take it. So I took myself off to Stirling and went into the markets there, not knowing anything at all, took advice. And I was very blessed that day because, the animals that are going through those markets are hugely expensive, well over my budget. I'd only given myself £50 over what I spent on this tup from years before. So I had a total sum of about £400. And the bell suddenly rang in the other ring and everybody jumped through. And that meant that I was able to purchase a tup that really should have been well over £1,000 for my budget of £425. I went over the budget there. And it was him that gave me such fantastic lambs the year afterwards, and gave me a hell of a lot more experience in handling, because he was such a big creature, and I really had to learn to keep myself safe in that journey. And that was really, really an amazing thing to do.
That's great. It's a lovely, positive story. Now, you've got a lovely collie as well called Maud, and I'm sure if anybody has already read your book, people will want to know how she is, because I know she has been a great solace and a great companion to you, especially when you've been on your own. How is she?
So Maud is now 13 and a half, and in my book, I'm an Island, I write of when I first take her on, and she arrives as a tiny foxy pup in the back of my truck, and really that extraordinary process of teaching each other how to herd and work with sheep. And she went so much beyond being just a pet and a companion. She's really she's been there for me at really critical points, almost giving an alarm when I needed help as well, going to find people, nudging me when I needed to get up off the floor, when I'd passed out, lost consciousness, when I broke my hands. She's just been such an immense support, and obviously with the swimming as well, coming with me to the water. She's always there like a guardian, watching when I'm swimming, and we sort of trek back and forth from the shore and so on. She had a series of strokes back in May. It was actually on the eve of the publication of the book, so it was a very, very difficult, very uplifting time, and also a very difficult time. And incredibly, with very careful nursing, she came through. So she's actually with me here now, and I hope she's got a few more years in her yet.
Well, I hope so too, because she's been definitely a real strength to you. Now, talking about swimming, we've just got a few minutes more before we're going to play your lovely film, and you have had an incredible relationship, an elemental relationship with the sea, but you just don't swim on beautiful sunny summer days. You swim 365 days a year, and I'm just full of admiration. And some of the descriptions of you taking to the water and the things you see and feel are incredible. And as I say, we will be seeing this film, but could you just give us a very brief overview, because we're running short of time, of how the swimming came about?
So the swimming came about urging people to the book, quite the concertinaing of events, really big events that fell wave after wave into my life, and made it very difficult to really continue at a point. And also with island life, it also became important for me to find a place where I could really inhabit a territory very freely. And so I took myself to the water, and extraordinary how uplifting not just the cold water and that cold water shock is to the system. It really shocks you out of anything that you're carrying. So there's a moment when you step off into the water where you let any weight or care slip off your shoulders, and you can inhabit yourself more freely. The wildlife and so on became an integral part of that. And so every morning at dawn for 4 years, I would wake, look to the sky, let the sky direct me in which direction I was going to go by the quality of the light, the weather, the wind and the tide. And I would then follow that. And it took any pressure off me to be anywhere other than where I should naturally be. And I found my great place of belonging and freedom and being in the water. And I don't think that's surprising given how much part of water we all are. And I think it's also very interesting how the hard lines that we can create in our own minds all dissolve. If you can just take that first breath and that first step forwards, it breaks an impasse. And the beauty of cold water swimming is that once you've done it once, that one breath, that one step, it's taking you ever closer into the water, and then suddenly the conditions that I'm swimming in, the waves just lift you up and you're off and away. And there's an immensely powerful learning in that, when you realise when you are physically out of your comfort zone and literally out of your depth, that is where you are most safe to be, because you have to find that calmness of breath. And I think coming back into your breath and that full awareness of presence and present moment is really something that I'd urge everybody to try in whatever way they can, with whatever form of wild water that is close to you, safely and so on. And do look at the landscape and tides and talk to people. Always try and go with someone if you can. But I'd urge everybody that hasn't tried that to try and find that joy of cold water swimming, which I explore in my book, I'm an Island.
Well, it really is a quite extraordinary book. I can't recommend it enough, because it is really, it's revealing, but it's also, it's just got so much positivity in it, because you aren't a victim in it, really. You're proving really the strength that we all have if we only look deep enough to overcome things which otherwise might seem impossible. So I'd like to thank you so much, Tamsin, for joining us today. Thank you, everybody else. And please remember that I Am an Island is available from preferably the Festival Bookshop, but if not, any bookshop preferably independent, please, or else the big one that we won't mention. And it really is a super book. So thank you again, Tamsin. And now we're going to see your lovely little film. Thank you.
Thanks.
I gasp as I step into the icy water. It stings and slaps against my shins. I cry out as it splashes over my chest and shoulders, but I keep walking. I do not drop my eyes. I know that the harsher the cold outside, the gentler the sea will feel. Diving into the freezing water brings me a peace unlike anything I have ever known. Cold gives no space for thought. It threads your heart and head beautifully together and binds them to each present moment. I feel safe, protected and warm. I reach out to the sea's silver scaffold and weave myself to its soft steel frame. For those minutes, I'm in its cold current and the sea flows through me. I am shell-spun, salt-burned, wind-wrapped and kindled like a broken piece of sea tinder that the light shines through. These days, the sea is no longer an object to me. It has a name and a presence that is loved and intimate. As the sea rises to meet me, I open to its beauty and flowing possibilities. Transformation is regenerative, redemptive, and comes with a struggle. For change to come, or to strike out differently, you have to let the rough edge of the pain of all that life throws at you graze your heart. Some days I feel like an oyster shell creating itself from a handful of grit from the inside out. Each day, the sea washes me smooth. As it draws back, it reveals a part of myself that is new and subtly different to me. When you step beyond your fears, it takes you into a wilder space. I am not who I was, but I am still evolving. This is just the beginning, I whisper to the sea. We are just starting out together. And then I gaze at the seals slipping under the tide, and I think of how much further I have still to swim.